Hello. Well, I started reading The Borrowers to you, I guess a couple of weeks ago. Then I've kind of got busy and got behind on reading. But we're going to commence it again on chapter 6. How about that? Because I think if you go back and look, chapter 5 was the last chapter we read. So let's go with chapter 6. The Borrowers by Mary Norton. Your mother and I got you up, said Pa, to tell you about upstairs. Arietty, holding the great cup in both hands, looked him over the edge. Pa coughed. You said a while back that the sky was dark brown with cracks in it. Well, it isn't. He looked at her almost accusingly. It's blue. I know, said Arietta. You know, exclaimed Pa. Yes, of course I know. I've got the grating. Can you see the sky through the grating? Go on, interrupted Homily. Tell her about the gates. Well, said Pod ponderously, if you go outside this room, what do you see? A dark passage, said Arietty. And what else? Other rooms. And if you go further, more passages. And if you go on walking, on, and all the passages under the floor, however they twist and turn, what do you find? Gates, said Arietta. Strong gates, said Pod. Gates you can't open. What are they there for? Against the mice, said Arietta. Yes, agreed Pod uncertainly, as though he gave her half a mark, but mice never hurt anyone. What else? Rats? Suggested Arietta. We don't have rats, said Pod. What about cats? Cats? Echoed Arietta surprisingly. Or to keep you in, suggested Pod. To keep me in, repeated Arietta, dismayed. Upstairs is a dangerous place, said Pod. And you, Arietta, you're all we've got, see? It isn't like Hendreary. He still has 2 of his own and 1 of hers. Once, said Pod, Hendreary had 3 of her own. Your father's thinking of Egalatina, said Homily. Yes, said Pod, Egalatina. They never told her about upstairs, and they hadn't got no grating. They told her the sky was nailed up with cracks in it. A foolish way to bring up a child, murmured Homily. She sniffed slightly and touched Arietta's hair. But Egalatina was no fool, said Pod. She didn't believe them. So one day, he went on, she went upstairs to see for herself. How did she get out? Asked Arietta, interested. Well, we didn't have so many gates then, just the one under the clock. Hendreary must have left it unlocked or something. Anyway, Egalatina went out. In a blue dress, said Homily, and a pair of button boots your father made her. Yellow kid with jet beads for buttons. Lovely they were. Well, said Pod, any other time it might have been all right. She'd have gone out, had a look around, had a bit of a fright maybe, and come back, none the worse and no one the wiser. But things had been happening, said Homily. Yes, said Pod, she didn't know, as they never told her, that her father had been seen, and that upstairs they had got in the cat, and... They waited a week, said Homily, and they waited a month, and they hoped for a year, but no one ever saw Egalatina no more. And that, said Pod after a pause, and eyeing Arietta, is what happened to Egalatina. There was silence except for Pod's breathing and the faint bubble of the soup. It just broke up your Uncle Hendreary, said Homily at last. He never went upstairs again. In case he said he found the button boots. Their only future was to emigrate. Arietta was silent a moment. Then she raised her head. Why did you tell me? She asked. Now? Tonight? Homily got up. She moved restlessly toward the stove. We don't never talk of it, she said, at least not much. But tonight we felt, she turned suddenly, well, we'll just say it straight out. Your father's been seen, Arietta. Oh, said Arietta, who by? Well, by something you never heard of, but that's not the point. The point is, you think they'll get a cat? They may, said Homily. Arietta set down the soup for a moment. She stared into the cup as it stood beside her almost knee-high on the floor. There was a dreamy, secret something about her lowered face. Couldn't we emigrate? She ventured at last, very softly. Homily gasped and clasped her hand and swung away toward the wall. You don't know what you're talking about, she cried, addressing a frying pan which hung there. Worms and weasels and cold and damp and... But supposing, said Arietty, that I went out like Egalatina did, and the cat ate me. Then you and Papa would emigrate, wouldn't you? She asked, and her voice faltered. Wouldn't you? Homily swung around again, this time toward Arietty. Her face looked very angry. I shall smack you, Arietty Clock, if you don't behave yourself this minute. Arietty's eyes filled with tears. I was only thinking, she said, that I'd like to be there, to emigrate too. Uneaten, she added softly, and the tears fell. Now, said Pod, this is enough. You get off the bed, Arietty, uneaten and unbeaten both, and we'll talk about it in the morning. It's not that I'm afraid, cried Arietty angrily. I like cats. I bet the cat didn't eat Egalatina. I bet she just ran away because she hated being cooped up. Day after day, week after week, year after year, like I do, she added on a sob. Cooped up, repeated Homily, astounded. Arietty put her face into her hands. Gates, she gasped. Gates, gates, gates. Pod and Homily stared at each other across Arietty's bowed shoulders. You didn't ought to have brought it up, he said unhappily. Not so late at night. Arietty raised her tear-streaked face. Late or early, what's the difference, she cried. Oh, I know Papa is a wonderful borrower. I know we managed to stay when all the others have gone. But what has it done for us in the end? I don't think it's so clever to live on alone forever and ever in a great big half-empty house under the floor with no one to talk to, no one to play with, nothing to see but dust and passages, no light but candlelight and firelight and what comes through the cracks. Egalatina had brothers and Egalatina had half-brothers. Egalatina had a tame mouse. Egalatina had yellow boots with jet buttons, and Egalatina did get out just once. Shush, said Pod gently, not so loud. Above their heads, the floor creaked, and heavy footfalls heaved deliberately to and fro. They heard Mrs. Driver grumbling voice and the clatter of the firearms. Drats this stove, they heard her say. Wind's in the east again. Then they heard her raise her voice and call, Camp Farrell? Pod sat staring glumly at the floor. Arietty shivered a little and hugged herself more tightly into the knitted quilt, and Homily drew a long, slow breath. Suddenly she raised her head. The child is right, she announced firmly. Arietty's eyes grew big. Oh, no, she began. It shocked her to be right. Parents were right, not children. Children could say anything. Arietty knew and enjoyed saying it, knowing always they were safe and wrong. You see, Pod, went on Homily, it was different for you and me. There was other families, other children. The sinks in the scullery, you remember? And those people who lived behind the knife machine. I forgot their names now. And the broom cupboard boys. And there was that underground passage from the stables, you know, that the rain pipes used. We had more, as you might say, freedom. Ah, yes, said Pod in a way. But where does freedom take you? He looked up uncertainly. Where are they all now? Some of them may have bettered themselves. I shouldn't wonder, said Homily sharply. Times have changed in the whole house. The pickings aren't what they were. There were those that went, you remember, when they dug a trench for the gas pipe, over the fields and through the wood and all. A kind of tunnel it gave them all the way to Leighton Buzzard. And what did they find there, said Pod unkindly. A mountain of coke. Homily turned away. Arietty, she said in the same firm voice, supposing one day we'd pick a special day when there was no one about, and providing that they don't get a cat, which I have my reasons for thinking they won't, supposing one day your father took you out borrowing. You'd be a good girl, wouldn't you? You'd do just what he said, quickly and quietly and no arguing. Arietty turned quite pink. She clasped her hands together. "Oh," she began in an ecstatic voice, but Pod put in quickly. "Now, Homily, we've got to think. You can't just say things like that without thinking it out proper. I've been seen, remember? There is no kind of time for taking a child upstairs." "There won't be no cat," said Homily. "There wasn't no screeching. It's not like that time with Rosa Hatchet." "All the same," said Pod uncertainly, "the risk is there. I've never heard of no girl going borrowing before." "The way I look at it," said Homily, "and it's only now it's coming to me, if you had a son, you'd take him borrowing, now wouldn't you?" "Well, you haven't got no son. Only Arietty. Suppose anything happened to you or me, where would Arietty be if she hadn't learned to borrow?" Pod stared down at his knees. "Yes," he said after a moment, "I see what you mean. And it'll give her a bit of interest like, and stop her hankering." "Hankering for what?" "For blue skies and grass and such like." Arietty caught her breath and Homily turned on her swiftly. "It's no good, Arietty. I'm not going to emigrate, not for you nor for anyone else." "Ah," said Pod and began to laugh. "So that's it." "Shush," said Homily, annoyed, and glanced quickly at the ceiling. "Not so loud. Now kiss your father, Arietty," she went on briskly, "and pop off back to bed." As Arietty snuggled down under the bedclothes, she felt creeping in from her toes a glow of happiness, like a glow of warmth. She heard their voices rising and falling in the next room. Homily went on, measured and confident. There was. Arietty felt a kind of conviction behind it. It was the winning voice. Once she heard Pod get up and scrape the scrape of a chair. "I don't like it," she heard him say. And she heard Homily whisper, "Hush," and there were tremendous footfalls on the floor above and the sudden clash of pans. Arietty, half dozing, gazed up at her painted ceiling. "Flora de Havana," proclaimed the banners proudly. There's her bed and the cigar box. "Oh, Garians, totas, superiors, non plus ultra, esquitos, and the lovely gauzy ladies blew their trumpets silently, triumphantly, on soundless notes of glee." That's the end of chapter 6. We'll stop there and we'll begin chapter 7 next time.